So hi everyone. I'm Bruce. I run a beamline at the National Synchrotron Light Source 2. I'm an employee of the National Institute of Standards and Technology, our national standards and metrology agency. And so my group is stationed at Brookhaven to run beamlines and develop methodology related to the use of the beamlines. I am pretty simply put, I'm like the XS guy. And so this is the part of the talk, right at the beginning, opening slide up. This is the moment where you usually thank the people who organize the workshop for the kind invitation. Well, that's all true. I actually want to say something else. I'm actually really impressed by how thoughtfully constructed this session is, because we're seeing and hopefully I will be able to finish up this trend, as well as Pedro and Brian started this trend of looking at data from all of the perspectives that it needs to be looked at. So Brian gave us the big overview, the global perspective, thinking about how data moves around through the ecosystem. Pedro, from my perspective, is very much in the camp of the person who is the visitor to a facility, who is a consumer of the data that gets generated by the facility. I'm the beamline guy. I'm pretty close to the bone of where the data that is generated comes from. And so the talk that I'm going to give today, the concepts that I'm going to try and get across today are very much from that perspective, which is, different from Pedro's perspective and different from Brian's perspective, without like devaluing either of those. That whole triangle of, overview of the ecosystem, consumer of the data, producer of the data, they all have to be talking to each other and they all have to be working together. And that's, I think, the theme that I'm going for. Now, I'm going to start off with a little bit of a joke. Whoops, got to put the mouse in the right place. So I often come to workshops like this one. I often am asked to participate in workshops like this one, where there are speakers who are presenting this picture. There is the yellow brick road going off into the distance to the Emerald City, and majestic things are happening on the skyline. And it's amazing that there are people who can conceive of things on this scale. And what's even more amazing than that is that things on this scale get implemented and distributed and put into use. As much as I admire the people who can see this picture and implement this picture, this ain't me. So I'm this guy. I'm the guy who, as I'm walking down the road, I'm thinking about how the stones get placed in the road and how the flowers get planted on the side of the road. In no way, I'm not meaning to be snarky or sarcastic about the sorts of things Brian was talking about. I'm just saying that ain't me. I'm the bricklayer. I'm the guy who plants the flowers. And so what does that mean in the context of being the XS guy? And in the context of this particular workshop, which is hosted by an institution that's called a catalysis hub. Well, I mean, as I'm sure everybody here knows, my particular area of expertise, X-ray absorption spectroscopy, has become kind of invaluable to catalysis over the last couple of decades. It's very, very common these days that groups that do catalysis are also groups that visit beamlines like mine. So what does that mean? Well, in the context of data, of capturing metadata and distributing them, I'm going to tell this story. And my story starts about 6 years ago when I gave a talk at a meeting much like this one. It's the meeting that I'm showing you here on the screen. It was a satellite to a fairly recent XAFS conference. And it was a meeting that met a few days before the conference down in Karlsruhe, where KIT is, where the UNCA synchrotron is. And we talked about issues surrounding data, specifically XAFS data. Now, at that time, 6 years ago, I was spending a lot of time thinking about how to capture XS data. And what I saw at the time is the most relevant metadata in a way that was capturable and transferable. And here's what we came up with. Well, here's what we came up with as the challenges at the time. So I was worried about things like data archaeology. Um, as we were, for a while now in the synchrotron community, we've been around, we've had synchrotrons long enough that we're starting to see the phenomenon of uh, distinguished elders in the community coming to their time of retirement and sort of dumping a big pile of historical data in a place that's on the searchable web. But those data dumps tend to be archaeology exercises in the sense that they're often weird, quirky kinds of data that lack sufficient metadata to be useful, and yet they're there, and yet people want to use them. We have a lot of other problems. We had a lot of other problems that I was worried about at the time. Moving data between the beamline and data analysis, sharing data between different analysis packages, submitting supplemental data, the whole thing. Um, all of these were problems that I was worried about at the time. And in truth, I still worry about all of these things, but sort of the scope of the things that I'm concerned about has grown. So let me show you where I was coming from. If you go and visit different XS data, different XS beamlines around the world, you will see that you get your data back in a lot of quirky different ways. And, every beamline presumably has reasons why they give you the data in the way that they do, and those reasons are possibly reasonable. Here are a couple of examples of I'm sort of being a little bit unfair. I'm choosing a now decommissioned synchrotron and a very well established operating for decades example, the old NSLS and Photon Factory and the other facilities in Japan. And these are the sorts of data that they deliver. And these are both to a human observer fairly interpretable. I mean, there's an obvious data table that you could presumably interpret in some manner, and there's a data table down here. The one on the left is maybe a bit easier to interpret because there are column labels. You might need to have some additional knowledge that is not captured in the file to interpret the data table in the example on the left. But neither of these is really a good example of preserving data. Both of them do some job of preserving information about the measurement that happened, but they're done in clunky, awkward ways. There's not immediately obvious separation between the metadata content and the data content. You could say that, well, the data content is where the columns of numbers happen. But then if you look over here at the one on the right, where the columns of numbers start happening is still in the metadata part of the file. And if you had a simple computer program reading this, looking for the data table, it would get to the line that starts with 1 underneath the word block and say, okay, I'm there, here's numbers. And then it would get down to this line that starts with ORTEC and it wouldn't know what to do. So I mean, these things are kind of a mess and they are hindering the ability of our visitors. They are hindering the ability of our consumers, folks like Pedro, to come and use these data because each place has its own weird stuff. So here I'm summarizing, when I gave this talk 6 years ago, this was sort of the drive home the point page. These files often require all kinds of processing. Like this one on the right, you'll notice presents the x-axis, what's normally the energy axis in XFs. It presents it as monochromator angle, and so you have to somehow convert that to energy. There are other data conversion problems you might have, like dead time correction if you're using an energy discriminating detector, or merging lots of scans. Because the file formats are so weird and quirky, Software and plotting software might have trouble knowing what to do with the file. And you probably don't want to throw files like this in an archive for supplemental material to journal. But it turns out that the biggest problem here is bullet point 2, and that is that the metadata is captured in really inappropriate or incomplete ways. So at the time, 6 years ago, we worked on the sort of bottom level of the data capturing and data preservation problem. Now, as I go through this slide, I don't want to suggest that this is where the problem stops, because obviously when somebody visits my Beamline, they measure more than one sample, they measure more than one spectrum. They have a whole volume of data that needs to be organized in some way. And the question of how you organize larger and larger volumes of data is a very valid question, and not the question that's being answered right here, right now. Right here, right now, I'm worried about the smallest unit of currency. I'm worried about the dollar bill or the euro coin or the £1 coin, the thing that is the unit of currency, the building block for larger sums of money, for larger quantities of data. So we decided that we wanted an interchange format, a way of representing a mu of E spectrum that's easy for both a human agent and a computer agent to understand and read. We wanted a common tongue for moving that spectrum between all the human and machine agents that need to consume it. That's the experimenter, that's the data archiver, that's data analysis packages, things on the web, journals, really anybody that needs to see that data can then know how to read that data. In doing this, we hope to make data longer lived and reduce this data archaeology problem that we see all over the place. And this is getting to the point I was making a second ago, that we have bigger experiments that are built out of XF's measurements and other things. So we might have complex disparate data volumes. We might have a multispectral experiment, like for example, at a fluorescence microprobe, you might have a fluorescence map and want to go to a spot and understand the XF spectrum from a spot. So you need to extract XF's data from this multispectral experiment. And then of course, we want something to build upon to make bigger data structures. And here's what we came up with. It's a fairly simple file that doesn't look horribly different from the examples that I gave as inadequate examples, but it has enough syntactic sugar, enough coding to make it something that is bigger than those were. There's still a data table at the bottom. We specify columns so that it can be understood, but we also specify a way of capturing the metadata that's considered essential for this extraction of an XF spectrum from a larger data volume. This thing has a clearly defined data table. It has defined families of metadata. It's extensible, it's versioned. It does all the things that you need something like this to do. It has a GitHub page, another thing you need something like this to do. And then most importantly, what it's got is a specification. So we say what the file is, and it has a dictionary of the basic kinds of metadata that we recognize as always interesting, always essential for an XF's measurement. So this is a thing that can be used today. I wish it were more widely adopted. I wish more of the other Beamlines, even at my own facility, used it fully and appropriately. But you know, aside from adoption issues, it holds up pretty well 6 years later. But now it's 6 years later, and instead of running a very old Beamline at a very old facility, I'm running a brand new Beamline at a brand new facility. BMM, the Beamline for Materials Measurement. Here's a picture of it. It's an XF Beamline. We've also got a goniometer and do some diffraction work, but I'm in charge of the XF's end station here. And at BMM, we continue to do all of the experiments that I was worried about and thinking about 6 years ago when we made XDI. But as time goes by, I find myself doing more in situ and operando stuff with my users, with my visitors, and other kinds of interesting experiments. I've got my first foray into machine learning, that is, into a machine agent making decisions about what experiment to do next. The common thread in all of these is that you need to tag your data well with metadata so that you can, well, in the case of an electrochemistry experiment, for example, you want to be able to correlate the XF's measurements that are being made with the electrochemical status of the system at the time those XF scans were made. In a machine learning context, there are all kinds of metadata that you might need to tag with the data in order to allow your agent to make good decisions. So metadata is the common thread among these interesting experiments. At NSLS2, we use our data acquisition, data processing, data storage, data delivery ecosystem is a thing that its developers call Blue Sky. I'm certainly not going to be able to do justice to Blue Sky in the 5.5 minutes I have left in my time. There's a link down here if you're interested. It's a really cool project. It's made it super easy for me to develop a very rich system at the beamline. The part I want to draw your attention to is that all of the information in the experiment, as much as possible, gets streamed into what we call our data broker. This provides a really rich data model for handling the data in both directions. So not only does this data model help us think about how to move on to data analysis, but it helps us think about how to move back into the experimental loop and make interesting human and machine decisions about what to do in the experiment. Now, let's talk about that data model. So the back end of Data Broker is a database. We happen to use Mongo for those who care about such things. The part that's interesting for the person thinking about this problem is that in the language of Data Broker, in the thought process of Data Broker, a run generates a bunch of documents. So a run is a thing you want to do, like an XF scan, for example. It might be something simpler or more complicated than an XF scan, but it's sort of an atomic chunk of an experiment. The run generates 6 kinds of documents, and those documents have a schema, they're well defined, it is knowable what's in the documents, they can be accessed, they can be searched, and they come in 6 varieties. There's a document that is the start document where we can write down everything about the experiment that we know going in. So that's the who, the what, the why, and all of the kinds of metadata you can think of go into the start document. There's also a stop document. So that's the things we know at the end of a run, the time that it ends, its exit status, whether it succeeded or failed, that kind of thing. And then in the middle, there are events, which are individual measurements that are time-stamped. In the context of an XF scan, that would be an energy point in the XF scan. There's a descriptor for the event that gives things like units and labels so that the numbers have meaning. You might need what we call a resource, which is a pointer to something external. In the context of the electrochemistry experiment I suggested a minute ago, that could be like the data from the potentiostat saved to a file. You have a pointer to where that's saved. And then if you need something more fine-grained, a datum is a pointer to something inside the resource. So taken together, all of this is an experiment. And it's a really good model. And so now if you imagine that all parts of the experiment, not just the photon delivery system and the detectors and stages, not just the things that you associate specifically with the beamline, but if everything else is all reading into this data model, your furnace, your gas flow, your ancillary measurements like mass spec or IR or whatever else you're doing at the same time as you're measuring XF, if all of those things go subscribe to this data model and put their data in the database that way, then we have this rich environment of data where you know or can recover or can even predict temporal correlations between all of these things. I will leave it to the chemists who are listening here to really think about how you put together a bunch of individual measurements into an experiment, something that really encompasses the science that you're trying to do. But as long as you have these rich backends to the experiment, you can get there. Now, what's the connection between 6 years ago and 6 years later? Well, the connection is, it turns out, the metadata. Everything that you need to do, all of the problems I was worried about before, and all of the problems that I'm worried about with the more recent kinds of experiments, it all comes down to the metadata. The better you tag your data with metadata, the more interpretable the data is, the better human and machine agents can do things with the data. That's not really intended to be a profound statement. It's basically exactly the same thing that both of the previous speakers said. I just said it in my words with my silly American accent. In the context of where we were 6 years ago, I am arguing that these formats do a poor job of presenting metadata along with the data table. And I am saying that in the context of XDI, the simple problem that XDI was trying to solve, it does a much better job of preserving and presenting the data that stands to the side of the main data, metadata. So I'm going to end this with, I guess you could call it a little bit of finger wagging. And I'm just going to make the point that computers are really good at recording things. And at the Beamline, computers should be doing all of this. I hear often from the visitors to my Beamline and even some of my colleagues at the facility that if you're not keeping a lab notebook at the Beamline, you're not really doing an experiment. And I actually think exactly the opposite is true, that if you are trapping information in a lab notebook, you're doing a bad job of doing the experiment. Everything that's important should be recorded and associated with the data. So when you as an individual at home or at a facility are designing and performing an experiment, have your computers record all the things. And when you go to the synchrotron, and this middle part is actually the part that it's like the only place where I can claim the moral high ground and really wag my finger at people. And that is, the people at the synchrotron really need to be embracing this and doing this. So if you as a visitor to a Beamline like mine aren't getting the information that you need, insist that we do that. And then if you have those beautiful, rich, well-tagged sets of data, you can actually interpret the experiment. And when you do so, use all the things. You've got all this data, you've got all this metadata. You now have the full picture and you can go off and do science. So that's my last slide.
Thank you very much. Slightly different perspective from the first two talks and a really interesting one. Does anyone have any questions? If you want to type them in the chat, or if you're, one's coming already from Donnie. How would you handle the integration of different cells into the data recording?
Oh yeah, no, that's a fantastic question. So let me put this screen. Hang on, I wanna just get zoom back up to the place so that it looks like I'm looking at the camera. So how do you integrate a cell or an instrument, what I was calling an ancillary instrument? That's a fantastic question, and it turns out to be the really hard part of the problem, and a part of the problem I am still working on at BMM, at my Beamline. But the bottom line is that every synchrotron has a control system. We use a thing called epochs at NSLS2. I believe Diamond uses epochs also. There's another one, it's called Tango. There are facilities on the continent that use Tango. The point is, I'm agnostic about which is used. But the point is that instruments should be designed to talk that language. Because if the ancillary instrument comes to the beamline and is controlled by Epix or controlled by Tango as appropriate, then it's much easier to implement that strongly into the control system at the beamline, and much easier to gather that data and metadata in a way that is packaged consistently. In the context of NSLS2, that provides us an avenue for streaming that data into Data Broker and making it available according to Data Broker's data model. Now, that's hard because I can't make every instrument that my users want to use. They bring stuff. So I think the answer to that is, you know, we already ask our users to define like an electrochemistry or a catalytic reactor or some kind of cell. We already ask them to design it in a way that the X-rays can get in and the X-rays can get out. We have to make the additional step of requesting that our users go one step farther and work with us to integrate the thing into the control system. And if you do that, you have an avenue for capturing all this metadata. So great question.
Okay. Thanks, Donny. Oh, he's come back. Would using a higher level integration, e.g. LabVIEW, help?
Boy, how do I answer that question? Sure, if it helps you, then that's great. You will not come to my beamline and find LabVIEW. It's not my cup of tea. I think these things can be done in other ways without A, the proprietary solution, and without the incredibly quirky way of solving problems that LabVIEW provides. But we're getting into my biases rather than my opinions here.
Okay. Thank you for that. Are there any more questions? Do any of the panelists have any questions?
Yeah, Brian's raising his hand.
Oh, please go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, thanks, Bruce. That was a fantastic talk. I did, yeah, I think we did dovetail quite well. I was given the 50,000 feet point of view, but it kind of illustrates very well exactly what a project like ours is identifying and trying to produce at least a guideline on how you might do that, and you're doing that on a particular instance. I have a couple of questions though. Firstly, having defined your metadata, do you have difficulties plugging in commercial instruments to actually produce that kind of metadata in a sensible way?
Yes, bane of my existence. I have a lovely potentiostat that my users are familiar with, that does everything so far that we've needed to do at the beamline, but it is a proprietary instrument that is sort of well supported by Epix. I don't have yet, I have not yet gotten attention from a controls engineer to finish the job of integrating it into the beamline. So yeah, proprietary instrumentation is a real problem.
You have to pay extra work trying to kind of adapt the output into your metadata.
Yeah, because, you know, if the information is only available to the user by opening up a specific Windows application and clicking on a specific button, that's extremely hard to streamline and automate. And it also leads to sort of what I call the octopus problem at the beamline, which is that you find yourself needing to run the beamline with this hand, run one instrument with the other hand, and run the third instrument with your third hand. And how, you know, that's not a sustainable way of running a facility like my beamline.
Thank you very much, Bruce.